Didn't realize that was a question.
Number 2 is that, according to the brand of Christianity assumed by the transcendental argument, God created everything, including logic, or at least everything, including logic, is dependent upon God. Here's kind of where I think this argument falls apart.
No, go ahead. That 2.2 doesn't seem jive. Even
No,
to me.
I agree. I argue the argument falls apart because I don't think any Christian, at least that I've heard, maybe Ray Comfort perhaps, but, would argue that God created logic. I think it's always been pretty well understood in the Christian worldview that logic is entailed within God's essence. It's part of His being, and that that kind of circumvents the whole idea. But anyway, so that's not really an accurate characterization of Christianity. So the argument is basically a straw man. Straw man is another fallacy that basically where you attack an argument that is not the argument the person is presenting as if it were the argument. Like you're fighting a man made of straw instead of the person himself. But so premise 2 pretty much renders the entire argument a straw man. But we'll go on anyway. Number 3 is if something is created by or is dependent on God, it is not necessary. It is contingent on God. Okay, I would agree with that premise. Number 4, if principles of logic are contingent on God, they are not logically necessary. Yeah, I would agree. Number 5, if principles of logic are contingent on God, God could arrange matters so that a proposition and its negation were true at the same time. But this is absurd. I agree. He's basically saying if that were the case, if principles of logic were contingent on God, then God could create square circles, marry bachelors, etc. I would agree. Then the conclusion, hence logic is not dependent on God, and insofar as the Christian worldview assumes that logic is so dependent, it is false. Once again, I agree with the conclusion of the argument, but the argument doesn't really address Christianity, or at least Christianity as I commonly think.
Poorly worded, at least in point 2, because you would say that logic would be intrinsic of God. So there would be no way that He could screw with logic in the universe or in any other universe that He could have.
Barely.
I was going to say, because if He's an omnipotent being, then He could theoretically make logic whatever He wanted to, even if it was contingent on Himself. If it was contingent on Himself, then He could just change Himself because He's an omnipotent being.
But,
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say, contingent isn't really a good word here. It's
True.
Intrinsic to
Intrinsic.
nature, not contingent.
Touche.
Well, and also, one of the aspects of the Christian worldview is that God does not change, that He is immutable. So that kind of renders that criticism kind of neutered, you might say.
To the extension of as you perceive your God to be unchangeable.
Right. So he has that's the transcendental argument against God from the viewpoint of logic. He also has one for science and one for morality. They basically follow the same line of reasoning. And he basically stole the line of reasoning from the Euthyphro dilemma, which was an ethical dilemma that was in one of Socrates' writings. But that's basically the material I have for this. We can talk about the different objections that were made, and
I have
other
a question.
certainly.
I mean, most of this stuff is over my head, so. But I was just wondering, if you assume that the laws of logic must be based on something, isn't that presupposing that that you need to explain the laws of logic or use logic to explain logic? Like.
It's not presupposing that you need to do that, but I am saying that yes, you do need to account for
all
that.
right, but what if logic is priority? Like, what if it's just an inherent function of humanity and it's used, like we communicate ideas using logic?
So are you saying it is
The reason why
conventional,
logic
or are
works-
you saying
yeah.
all right, so it's something we agree upon, or is it something that is
I'm
true
saying-
because
I'm
it's
saying
just
it's-
part of the fabric of reality?
I'm saying it's something we agree upon.
Okay, the
And
problem
it's based on the general fabric of reality, but it's
that's sort of the role that a posteriori reasoning plays is that looking at the world and talking with each other is that ultimately it becomes subjective.
Well, the thing is, what I was saying is that it would be more like an inborn quality, not something that we would acquire from talking to each other. And I think it is subjective. I mean, you could have someone in this room who would stand up and say, I don't have to listen to you because I am a squid. And you have, there's no way to prove them wrong. You wouldn't be able to use the laws of logic to convince them of anything.
Well,
should
I'm
be,
saying there's
but
some
the issue
people
the issue
who
is
don't.
right. I certainly agree that there are people that do not use the laws of logic, but those people, regardless of what they believe or don't believe, are incapable of violating the laws of logic. That person can call themselves a squid. I think that's what you said. But I mean,
Well, then aren't the laws of logic, isn't that, you're saying laws of, but say like a square circle, these are matters of semantics, these are language, right?
but language is based on logic
Language is based on reality.
and logic.
Well, yeah, and logic is an inborn quality, but I mean, you can't have a square circle because a circle is one thing and a square.
I
These
agree.
are names we give to two different.
They're names, but the concept is that one thing is not another thing. That's one of the basic laws of logic.
And how do you know a crazy person can't imagine a square circle? I mean,
Because that would basically invalidate all reasoning whatsoever.
but they don't have reasoning. They don't
They
have any
do, but
reasoning.
the thing is, because those terms are mutually exclusive, they would not be able to do that without essentially unraveling time-space. Because by violating those laws, they would.
But they're not.
Sorry, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, so what you're saying is that if people can imagine it because their brain works differently than everybody else's, that would say that it doesn't work. So you're saying that if someone could imagine a square circle, then that would make it logical. For example, we can imagine ourselves flying.
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm
Okay.
saying that
Maybe I'm
this
missing.
person, I'm saying that logic,
Doesn't apply to
their
them.
idea of logic,
Okay.
or it might not apply to the norm, or they might not have logic.
But I think what Riley's trying to say is that logic applies to reality. So, for example, someone might be able to imagine a square circle, which is a contradiction, but they could not create it. So it's like a law of
Yeah, but
physics.
that's the laws of physics working there. These are just.
I would argue that they would be able to imagine it anyway. I mean, I don't think that mental
Right.
illness enables someone to circumvent laws that are entailed within reality.
So
assuming they're entailed within reality and not
Yeah,
objective.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is exactly what you were saying earlier, but what you're saying, laws of logic can be a priori, like knowing we exist is a priori, we just know them and don't account for them?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
what I was saying.
One other point.
But I was saying that
I
as
was gonna ask
the
you.
fact that they're inborn into us because we
thanks, Riley.
No, no.
evolved, for instance, in reality.
Good. That brings back the argument I made earlier that if they are simply inborn and part of the natural order of things, we have no reason to trust those propositions.
Why okay, so I would agree that we really have no reason to trust those propositions besides that we are intrinsically inclined to because of our background in reality.
Okay, you would argue, but in order to argue, you have to presuppose lots of logic that they're
No, I
true and
just have to
authoritative.
presuppose that you also have intrinsically
Right,
inborn
but
qualities.
if they are not true, if they're not true and they are not authoritative, not imperative, there can't be any dialogue between us because they have to both
And
be.
maybe there isn't. Maybe you're nuts.
So we're just talking at each other and nothing happens.
I thought we covered this last time, or maybe this time before.
Right, and that's
Yeah.
why I mentioned to James earlier that the only other options I can foresee being logically viable are nihilism or absurdism, in which case nothing makes any sense and we're all just basically
Well, that's absurdism.
right.
Absurdism, nothing makes any sense. Nihilism is just looking and saying there's not really many ways to prove this at this point, or at least there's no intrinsic meaning in almost everything.
Well, yeah, nihilism is there is no intrinsic meaning in anything. So meaning is simply described by subjectively by individuals whatsoever.
Yes.
And I would argue that you can presuppose that, but it does not offer any reason to accept any proposition or to do science or to use philosophy or any other thing other than just I arbitrarily choose to do this today.
Well, of
Yeah.
course.
That
But
makes
then again,
sense.
we're not talking about we're not really talking about behaviorism. We're more talking about universal justification of these things. It could be that there is absolutely no universal justification for the notions of the laws of logic outside of ourselves, and yet we use them anyways.
May I interject before everybody leaves? Our group's having a big old Thanksgiving dinner on Sunday night, like at 5.
I just wanted to bring that.
I have one flyer that Dan did up.
Oh,
But
nice.
we just wanted to invite everybody to come over and eat dinner with us. It's not like churchy or anything. We're just hanging out, having a good time.
On
Doing
Sunday?
Thanksgiving. Yeah, Sunday night. You guys want? I have one whole flyer, but we're gonna. Can you email everybody?